In this video, we're going to be talking about comparing oscillator sections from one subtractive synth to another. But if you are still in the beginning stages of learning synthesis and you haven't taken my advice and gone back to some of those previous resources that I've tried to point you in the direction of, one thing I would recommend that oftentimes helps is adding in a couple of visual aids for you. So we have an oscilloscope. This is the Smexoscope available for free. And then we have the span, which serves as our spectrum analyzer. So for example, here with the polysynth, if we see that what we have selected is a sawtooth wave, we can see the sawtooth wave in the oscilloscope, and then we can see its harmonic makeup here in the span. And so when we go then from the square to the saw, we can see that difference and start to see the options that we have in this oscillator. Now, really what it's going to come down to over time is that you realize it's more about the sound than it is about visualizing these things. They're useful, but they're not really going to help you make better sounds. However, at the beginning, I've always found that having these aids really helps some of these concepts and ideas click. Especially then, we see what happens when we add the filter in, et cetera, et cetera. If we add sub in, what is that really? Well, it's just kind of like a square wave an octave below. We can see how that changes the makeup and how it changes the scope. So just some things to keep in mind. I'm not going to be using the oscilloscope or the spectrum moving forward, but it may be useful to some of you who are still just starting out with subtractive synthesis. So really, this shouldn't be too difficult. All we're doing is comparing the options that we have in the oscillator section of each subtractive synth that we load up. All right, and I'm just going to run through a few examples. I really am trying to put home this idea that it shouldn't matter what instrument you open up. As long as you can navigate and find that oscillator section, you should be able to make these comparisons. We're not focused on the sound just now. So we're not like comparing how one oscillator sounds audio engine wise in one instrument to another. That's going to come up later on. But let's just get started here with this very basic instrument that comes with Reactor. It's called the, Equinox Deluxe. All right. And if we have this first preset loaded, I play some sounds. What I see is a cutoff. So I'm imagining this is a filter, right? I have resonance, I have attack and release, but I don't actually see anything labeled oscillator. So I'm wondering, is this a physical modeled instrument? Is that what we're actually dealing with here? Doesn't seem like it. Right, I'm not able to really find something that's changing that main timbre. And so what this is kind of telling me is this instrument seems to more or less be like a synthetic string instrument. That's what it does, and that's kind of all it does. So there must be an oscillator in here somewhere, but I'm not having any control over it. And so that would kind of be our first class of instrument, an oscillator where you can't actually change any of the settings. It's pretty much just hardwired as it is. And if I go in here to the edit section and I go ahead and I load in the ensemble itself, and let's just go ahead and get like a split view happening here. What we're going to see is when I go in here that we have this like strings macro. And when I go in there, what I do find is that we will see in here somewhere, there's a saw. So there is an oscillator built into this thing. It's just not anything we can control. It just is what it is. A sawtooth wave. And so once I know that, I know, okay, this is probably functioning in a subtractive sort of signal flow. I don't have any control over the oscillator, so I'm going to move on and look at the other things inside of the instrument. The Equinox Deluxe is actually really rare. You're not going to find too many subtractive synths that don't give you any control over the oscillators. And so we're just going to kind of go through some more examples, moving on now to the more analog, modeled type instruments where you're probably not going to have like a ton of creative control. Not like a lot of special effects or anything like that built into the oscillators, but you will be able to typically change the shape and then create a balance. And we're starting here with the tall bass line. I know this is very hard to read, but this is a very basic and simple instrument where we have a source mixer, we have our VCO, okay? So VCO, voltage controlled oscillator, that's the module I guess we'll focus on first. But we can also look up the source mixer. Maybe that's the better place to start, because when I hit a note, we're actually already getting a balance of two oscillators. All right, we have a saw, and then we also have a sub, which in this case is functioning as a saw. But let's just get rid of the sub for now, even get rid of the saw, and you're going to hear no sound, right? We need to make sure we bring some signal up if we're going to hear something. We have a white noise generator. And that's something you'll oftentimes find in some of these basic subtractive synthesizers. But let's bring up our sawtooth. If we go to the VCO, we can then see that we can change the pitch of this. We also have a pulse width control, but that's not going to do anything on the sawtooth wave because it's actually linked to the pulse width, okay? The pulse wave, as they call it, which can function as a square wave, or of course you can kind of lessen that duty cycle and you can make it more like a sharp rectangle on one side and then like a very thin one on the other. This would be a useful time to have your oscilloscope open. As I bring up this pulse, we can hear the timbral difference, and we can then adjust the pulse width. And if we want, we can also then have that controlled by a modulator. So we could have it controlled by the LFO, which is here in the modulator section. Let's slow it down. So that's a way to get a little bit of movement into this sound. I'm hearing that there's some glide on this. I'm just going to turn that off. And then one other interesting oscillator feature that you may not be aware of is that there is a unison control on here. So I could turn that on. All right, we can bring in some sub, and now here is where this instrument becomes more virtual and less like real. I have like a drop-down menu of different options for my sub, so if I want to bring this down further, or instead of using a saw, we can actually use then a pulse wave. Bring in a little of this saw. And we could also then have a little bit of LFO going on the pitch. Right, and you can see we haven't touched the filter. We haven't even touched any sort of like amplitude envelope. We've just left all of these things static. And what it's really doing is giving you like a lot of options just from these few little controls. And that's the thing to be aware of with all of these instruments is you don't need to have 800 drop-down menus to make an interesting and compelling sound. Just using something like this tall bass line, we could spend a good 2 or 3 hours really kind of getting all sorts of different timbres and sounds out of it. We're now looking at Synth 1, and we can see it has a much larger oscillator section, especially when it comes to choosing different parameters than anything we've looked at thus far. Right now, we have our mix set to be all the way over to oscillator 1. We have a sawtooth wave selected, and we can hear that like so. No sub, nothing else. And then we have this detune and FM. And this is odd because when I use the detune, what you're going to hear is that this isn't just one single voice. There's obviously multiple saw waves stacked on top of each other because we're getting that classic detune sound. And so that's something that's kind of hardwired into this. I can't get rid of that. It just is what it is. If I go into mono, it doesn't change it, right? If I go over to the square, we hear that for all of these oscillators. So who knows how many voices are built into that and stacked into that. But that is something that happens, and it's why it's so important to kind of take your time going through the different sections in all of the instruments that you bring up. We also have an FM control, which is true frequency modulation. As I start to bring this up on the sine wave, you're going to hear the pitch fluctuating back and forth. And then when we go up to a high enough setting, it's going to start to generate some of those side bands and create a different timbre. More on FM next week. But I would argue the really interesting part about this instrument is the relationship between Oscillators 1 and Oscillators 2, or I should say Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2. There might be some kind of a glitch in this instrument, something that I've exploited and used in the past, where if I'm going with like FM, and I put the sync on and I leave it here on this square, you're going to hear like a crazy effect. And so I'm not sure if this is supposed to happen. It doesn't really make sense, considering that the way I see it, I think a lot of times the amount of ring mod or the amount of sync really is actually dictated by being here on Oscillator 2. But I could then go in with this effect, and I could use this envelope to control the pitch of Oscillator 2. And let's put the amount like up. Let's go crazy. Let's go up 36. And we're going to bring this pitch down a little bit. Go down 12. And now listen to what's going to happen here when we start to include a little bit of this. And go and add unison onto this. And so depending on the note you hit, who had thought that it's possible to make a sound like that using just your oscillators and a little bit of effect processing? So anyway, that's me kind of using a hack on the instrument. I'm not sure if it's supposed to do that. I really don't think it is. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I just wanted to show you how when you do experiment a little bit, sometimes interesting things happen. All right, so let's go back in here and actually focus on Oscillator 2 and this ring mod setting and also this oscillator sync. Okay, so I'm going to take the mix. I'm going to go over to Oscillator 2. Get ourselves a little bit of a sawtooth wave happening there. I have control over the pitch. Let's bring it back up to its starting point. Turn on ring modulation. And right now the thing messing with that is this detune between Oscillators 1 and Oscillators 2. But when I go in and I make broader scoops with the pitch, getting some interesting effects there, obviously. And we can do the same thing with oscillator sync. Kind of your classic oscillator sync sound going up. And so again, you can see that the reason why you have control over Oscillator 2 here, you also could set the destination to go to the FM. But the reason it's set to Oscillator 2 pitch kind of by default is so you can take advantage of like your sync and your ring mod and then have some movement happening there. So we could do something like this. Just go up all the way. It makes it more fun that way. And this is a major part of the oscillator section, is being able to make these adjustments here. And so every setting you then adjust is going to impact this sound, right? Because this ring and sync is based on some of the settings here in Oscillator 1. So if we start to use FM, And then definitely putting some LFO somewhere. I'm not sure where I want to put it right now. Let's think about it. We could even put this LFO to go onto the FM. And let's have the second one control oscillator 2. Find some kind of sweet spot in here. Maybe start to use a little bit of this filter. Do it this way. So who would have ever thought that you could get a sound like that out of Synth 1? This is all about experimenting and kind of making some connections. So even though it doesn't seem like there's a lot of features built into this oscillator, you can push it and you can experiment and just go all out and end up with some really just... I never would have thought I would get a sound like that out of this by just starting this conversation by talking about oscillator features. And that's really the fun and joy of all this. I think I'm going to leave most of that little side tangent in with Synth 1 because I want you guys to know what it's like for me creating sounds and how much fun I have and how quickly I get immersed into it. And I know that for many of you, it's going to be the same thing. That's when you really know that this is something you love. It's when you're supposed to be focused on one thing, which is me just trying to stick to the oscillators and show you guys some of these differences. And yet, boom, I immediately go in and start making sounds. It's not like there's a better synthesizer. It's not like there's the best synthesizer out there. You can have a lot of fun. You can experiment with all of them, and they'll all get you some usable and interesting sounds. So far, we've stuck with static wave shapes. So if I wanted to go from a square to a saw, I actually had to click it, and then we jumped over to that oscillator. There was no way of kind of blending. But nowadays, that's really the popular thing, and it's available in pretty much all the digital synths that are coming out nowadays, even the ones that are supposedly very much more like analog modeled, and we'll look at that Inspire in just a second. But here in the polysynth, we have a very basic wavetable. We don't have choices. I can't go and like come in here and pick something different, but I can morph between a square up to a saw an octave above. And why is this important? Well, this is really important because this is changing our balance of harmonics, but it's doing so in a really smooth way. When it's the filter, these still exist. It's just the filter coming in and cutting them off, right? And this would be a good time to have your span open and kind of seeing the difference. However, thinking back to additive, this is kind of the same idea. It's changing the balance. It's an oscillator effect of sorts. And so when you combine movement of a wavetable with movement of a filter, you've added a whole nother dimension into the sound. And that's something to really maybe experiment with in most of the sounds you're creating when you have that ability. So you can see here, I can change and I can go to a square. I can change the pulse width of that. If I have something a little bit more saw-shaped, I can bring in a sub, which is a square an octave below, right? You can see how that square is trying to come through here. And I can then go in and I can change the pulse width of that as well. And I could change that independent to the pulse width on the main oscillator here shape. I could go and I can add oscillator sync. And all of these things, add a couple more voices. And then the really cool part is all of these things can be changed in real time. So I can go in, I'm going to change all of these to like random, and I'm going to slow all these LFOs down a pretty considerable amount. Let's go in here to just time. And now I'm going to have these go on some of these different controls. We'll leave this one in bipolar mode and just turn the depth down. And so again, this isn't me using a filter to adjust what's going on in the spectrum. This is me just adjusting these different shapes and the controls in the oscillator. It really gives your sounds another dimension because I could still go in and obviously use the filter if I wanted to. And now I can create something like this, use a little Oscillator FM. Let's go up an octave. Right, and so by bringing in all of this movement, it's taking that sound and it's giving it a whole nother dimension. So getting rid of that static oscillator, and this is of course an example to the extreme, but I just want to show you some of the timbral variations you're able to achieve without maybe just thinking the only thing you're allowed to move and modulate would be the filter. Moving on, we can look at Spire, and we can actually see that these four oscillators are very similar to the oscillator we just saw in the polysynth, in that we can change this saw to a square and then adjust pulse width. But this one even gives us a whole nother dimension, which is a very basic wavetable. And so we can go and we can actually choose another wave. So I'm just going to go in here and choose something like interesting. Let's go with Inter 2. I have no idea what this is going to sound like. And now I can take this wavetable and I can transition from, let's go to that perfect square wave into whatever this wave is here. That's not interesting enough. Let's get something actually interesting here. Let's choose like Robo. There we go. That's a lot more interesting. And then obviously we could modulate all of these parameters like we just did before. So let's kind of load something up here, get an interesting sound. Let's add some voices in here. So I'm thinking, why don't we go in? Is that even more? Let's add a little bit of release onto this. And then what I'm going to do is I'll go into the modulation matrix and I'm going to put envelope 2 to control this wavetable mix here. All right, so let's use the source. It's going to be envelope 2. Destination, we want to go to wavetable mix on oscillator 1. There it is. Let's set the depth. All right, we can hear what it's doing there. You can hear how it's cutting off from the release. So let's go into envelope 2. And what I want to do is actually something like this. So we have those fading out instead of having to like use a filter. I mean, we could still obviously use a filter. It'd probably be interesting. It's just a different way of doing things. Let's go in here and choose a filter. Use a different option here. And so by default, this should be going here, cutoff 1, amount all the way up. That should be for envelope 3, I believe. Yeah. And I'm sure we could find some use for a sound like this. Moving right along, we have Absynth, which oftentimes doesn't get showcased enough. I think it's just because of the user interface, but trust me, this instrument has a lot of oscillator options, including the ability to do what we've just been doing, which is morph between different waves. And the great thing with Absynth, as we've looked at before, I believe in the additive week, is that you can draw in your own waveform, so you can kind of create anything you want. But this is a very simple process. Right now we just have a sine wave. I'm going to go in, choose one of these morph waves. Let's use this one, and I'm just going to go into the new button. I can go over to the morph tab, and in the morph tab I'm able to now go between these wave shapes. So maybe I'll just open this all the way up on both of them. This one isn't that interesting. Let's go back and pick something else. Let's try the A version. Okay, this one's a little bit more interesting, and it will definitely get more interesting as we progress along in this video or I should say in this example, and keep pushing this further. So the way for me to modulate this is to make sure that I start with the transition up at 100, and then I'm going to scale myself down from there. If I go into the LFO section, let's just check to make sure this LFO is working. Yep, it's working. And now instead of using channel A volume, I'm going to send this to oscillator main morph. So that in and of itself is fairly interesting, but we can actually get this to be a lot more intriguing by using the envelopes inside of Absynth. That's kind of the way you would do it. So I'll go into envelope here, and you can see that we have control over each of the oscillator's amplitude envelopes individually. We're only using oscillator A, so let's make this more like a pad sound, perhaps. cool. And so we don't have to keep hearing that annoying buzzing there. Let's go to new here, and I'm going to choose Oscillator A, main morph. That's going to control that balance, and this is why we want it to be at 100%, because at the top, we are at 100%, but I don't even have to go to the top of this envelope if I don't want to do that. So now we can listen to this slide. And now to make this interesting, I can go back into my patch, and instead of working in single mode, I can actually work in double mode. And just as an FYI, you can see that transition there. And in double mode, I'm going to go over to my double, and this is the balance between the two. So we have a sine wave on this side. Let's keep this all the way up. And I'm going to go and choose, let's go with abrasive formants. That should be interesting. And again, I'm going to go in and choose new, and now I should be able to morph this as well. And so this one's quite interesting. Let's go back to our envelope, choose new, and I need to go and find mod morph. All right, let's do kind of the same thing, only on this one we're going to bring in an LFO because I want to show you some of the power of these absent things. And what I can actually do here is I can add in an LFO, and then I can adjust at each of these breakpoints LFO settings. So if I go from point 1 to point 2, I want this to go very slow. I can do it like this, and you can see how it's compensating. And it's going to speed up in the second quadrant. And then perhaps in this next quadrant, I want to slow it down again. And then at the end, I can have it go like really, really fast on the release. And now when we go back into the patch setting and we go between this mod, what we're really doing is then choosing that balance. And remember, they're moving at different times, so it's going to be very interesting when we're in the middle. And really listening there. Let's bring this one up an octave. Slightly detune it. And we could also have something modulating this, so maybe we just want to have a regular LFO doing that, but that's kind of boring. So let's create one more new envelope for the morph balance. I need to go back and make sure I set this at 100 as the default, just so I can get that full range there. And let's just go in here and just, you know, if we right click, we can add additional points and just sort of do something random, have it go over a really long period of time. I think I may have accidentally created 2 releases, which I did not want to do. I just want the one. And use something really bizarre like the organ. So the organ is actually the shape of my LFO. I'd like to keep this balance probably closer to the middle so that we're getting a little bit of both. And I'm just going to now go back into our patch, add some detune voices. Trying to figure out what the right octave range is. Let's go in. Let's add in some kind of an effect onto this. Let's go with the resonators, perhaps. That's pretty interesting right there. The two synthesizers that are really notorious for being able to morph between wave shapes or to morph between wavetables are Serum and Massive. And with Serum, you do get the ability to like download additional wavetables from the internet, or if you want to go so far as to create your own, that's totally possible. I have kind of a bad habit of downloading a bunch of different wavetables from the internet, and that's just because I sometimes like to just choose something at complete random and kind of use that to create a sound. But even the stuff that's just stock and built in works great. So let's just pick a wavetable here at random. Well, maybe not totally random. Let's go with the very famous French romantic composer Debussy. Let's bring in that wavetable. And whereas in Absinthe it takes a few steps to set it up, here in Serum, number one, we can listen to this wave. Kind of actually sounds like a mix between like a saw and a square, but you'll hear then as we go through this wavetable, we eventually start to depart from that and get a wave shape that we can't really maybe associate with anything else up until this point. And with this instrument also, it's very easy to create some movement here. So for example, we can do something like and this is just not something you can achieve with filters, right? It's using these wavetables, it's adding and removing partials in, you know, there's an order to it, but it's not as simple as just your low pass, you know, taking away the higher frequencies and then bringing them back in over time. And that's the advantage of, you know, digital synthesizers, I'd say, being able to work in the computer, is that it's so simple to set something like this up and get that diverse of a timbre that when combined with additional oscillators and filters and your other modulators, that's what gives you these really complex and evolving sounds that, you know, I personally love to make and love to listen to. The last little category of options you might find built into an oscillator are what I call oscillator effects. And in Diversion, those can be found down here, and you can right click and choose from a variety of effects that are, again, adding or subtracting partials, and they can all be modulated with LFOs, envelopes, and so forth. So just adding those layers and those dimensions and that movement to the sound, that what a lot of people will argue is what maybe separates your sound from somebody else's. I don't always think it's as simple as that, but these are ways to kind of do that. So for example, we have like a sub element here. Let me just go down one octave. You can hear what gets brought in when we bring that in. When we bring in brilliance, it's like, you know, hyping the top end. We go to a roast. Very subtle. Same with buzz. Let's try something else that's really going to make a big difference. Yeah, so something like this might be useful to be on an LFO, whereas the sub might be useful like in the middle of the sound. So you might like link this to a second envelope, and so you start to have the sub come in slowly. Like, let's just do that real quick. Let's add the envelope 2 to this, turn that on. And then we have to set the depth of that, obviously. And then meanwhile, we have like LFO1 working here on this scissors effect. And then let's actually just choose the waveform and get something like more interesting. Yeah, this is the most interesting one. Took me a little while. And then when we go up here and start to detune this a little. Right, without needing to use a filter or anything else, we already have a really interesting sound, just a single oscillator, and using some of these oscillator effects. I would argue that Razer is really a subtractive synthesizer that includes a lot of really cool like additive oscillator effects. So it generates its sound by taking advantage of additive principles, really focused around the harmonic series, and then you go through and run it through specialty effects, and you can even see here that in the initialize patch, we actually have a cutoff filter that's been enabled. I'm just going to go ahead and disable that and show you at least one example of kind of a cool oscillator effect that is built into this. So if I go down from pulse to saw and instead go over to format, we can see that we have a few interesting knobs we can choose from. That's definitely something we'd want to try to modulate, so I'm just going to go ahead and set that up now. I'm going to have it modulated by LFO1. We'll kind of just put it in the center. We'll set the depth. What I'm going to do is set the shape here to like random, but smooth random. Actually, let's go on the aggressive one, because that's going to be kind of more cool. So this is kind of cool. Right, that's not something you're normally going to find with most synthesizers. I can then go and I can add more of a basic level, like a pulse to saw, or maybe I'd go in here and use the duo saw. Let's go down an octave. Let's try turning on some of these effects. Let's definitely put our limiter on just to be safe. Very cool. Now let's try putting in one of these filters. So that might be useful. Is that something we can even modulate? Oh, that's too bad. It's actually something we can't. But phase is something we can, so let's use LFO2 on that. and set some depth on this. Put into beat. Still not slow enough for me. The other thing I really love about Razer is how you can just kind of go up and down octaves and get all sorts of really cool results. So that's just one example, again, how a basic oscillator effect can then take you in just a creative and sound design driven mindset, as you just saw me kind of go through there. We're going to end this presentation inside of Serum because I think that this instrument gives you the most possible timbres from the oscillator module when you combine this wavetable position with an oscillator effect, what they call the oscillator warp. And I'm not going to go through all these options with you, but needless to say, you can get a lot of different sounds out of this. And this might be a good time to have your oscilloscope and spectrum analyzer up. I'm just going to take an envelope here and put it on, and we're going to kind of go through this sound. So this is almost like a filter opening and closing. As you can see, it starts very dull and then it gets very bright. So we'll just bring the sustain down. We'll do something like this. And I'm just going to grab one of these warp effects at random. I'll use bend plus minus. Let's have this one controlled by some kind of an LFO. Let's go and grab like an interesting shape. This is interesting enough for me. So I'm just going to grab and make one more point just to spice things up. I'm going to bring it on. I'm just going to hit, put this into bipolar. So when we go in, start to add unison. Start to get some really interesting sounds. Without ever having to touch a filter. And then to make things more interesting, we'd go in, we'd add a second oscillator, more modulators, etc. But this is just a kind of lengthy video showing you all the diverse options and features that you're going to find inside of oscillators and different synthesizers, and how just from like one or two different options, it's so easy for your mind to just start racing and to start going in there experimenting and making sounds for yourself. That's kind of what I wanted to show you. I hope you've learned something new.